opinion polls about specific economic policies, on the whole, people are a long way to the left. That's true in England as much as it is in Scotland. People want to nationalise all the things, basically. They want radically redistributive taxes. They want increases in wages. If you ask people what kind of ratio between the top and the bottom they want, they say maybe 5 or 6 to 1 in terms of wages, when I think at the moment in Britain the CEO of the average FTSE 100 firm earns, I think it's 126 times the average worker in their company, never mind the bottom paid worker. People economically on the left, but if you ask them who do you trust on the economy, this abstract question, you get a very different answer. Huge numbers of people will say the Tories. We're taught to believe that the City are the kind of proponents of wisdom, of common sense in the country. I think it's really important that we on the left try and understand that there is this very effective construction of a chunk of common sense that promulgates across a huge swathe of Britain, and that's geographically different in various places. And I think you see that not just through economics, but I think it's most interesting when you look at it culturally. So I've got a few more stats here, and I suppose you might see this as the thriving or the flourishing of British nationalism. But for me, that functions to promulgate that economic common sense. So, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn was first elected Labour leader, what was the thing that he was attacked for? Was it that he wants to tax the rich and that's crazy? No, they didn't say that. Was it that he wants to nationalise everything and obviously that's a bad idea? The media barely mentioned that. It was that he didn't want to sing the national anthem. That was apparently the most important thing about why you shouldn't vote for him, you should hate him. And it's important that we remember that that does have a resonance across a lot of the country. There is a very strong sense of British nationalism. So when there was the Queen's Jubilee, there were 10,000 street parties across the country, one of the biggest events that's happened in modern times. 10,000 groups of people organising a street party. But for me, perhaps the most interesting statistic about modern British politics is that only 60 of those 10,000 street parties were in Scotland. And in fact, 20 of those were in Edinburgh, and another 20 odd. The biggest was in St Andrews, and almost all of the rest were organised by the Orange Lodge. The one in Glasgow ended in 3 arrests, which is somewhat different from the tone you might have got in Oxford. Or similarly, you've got, again, what I think is one of the most incredible things that's happened in Britain in recent years, where what I call Poppy Fest 2014, where you had 4 million people going to see some poppies made out of clay put next to the Tower of London. 4 million people, probably the biggest single in locus event that's happened in Britain in the last decade, was people going to remember a war that they don't know anyone who fought in. Almost all of them, their grandparents maybe just fought in it. Extraordinary display of a very particular form of nationalism, which has enough appeal to enough of the population. It's not, it's not explicitly racist, but it does conjure a sense of who we are as a nation. It creates a we that is British. But I think you also see it in a whole range of other ways, through what I call British Empire kitsch, through the keep calm and carry on mugs you see. I was, if you go around even tower blocks in Dundee, as I spent a lot of time doing during the election, you see a lot of Union flag doormats now. I don't think that was the case in my childhood. Maybe I don't remember, but I feel like there's been an increase in that. And that continues and operates in a way to assert this common sense. And again, we saw that in the 2015 election, where the Tories were very effective in England in saying you can't vote Labour, not because Labour's bad, but because then they'll rely on the SNP. And the SNP are outside this sort of, kind of slightly wanky term, this imperial imaginary. They're outside our sense of common sense. There's this whole other world there, and Labour will rely on that, and that's the worst possible thing you can imagine. And so that's used to assert the economic dominance, absolutely, of the City, even though people, when you ask them about the City and about what it does, hate it. But they buy into the cultural iconography of it. And I think the other thing that's important about that is that what we see in Scotland in recent years is the loss of the grip of that sense of common sense. Now, in a way, it's probably not been there in the same way for a long time. The national sense is different. It's not necessarily better, but it's a different thing. Westminster can't assert control on us emotionally through that kind of sense of nationalism. It's very good at asserting it across particularly the home counties, but also other bits of England. And that creates an opportunity, particularly with the sort of crisis that is happening in my industry, in the media, for us to reconstruct a new kind of common sense, what Ramsay would call a good sense. It creates an opportunity for us to do that, but also it's important for us to remember, I think, that won't inevitably happen. That unless those of us on the left continue to work hard to construct a new sense of a new sense of what is within the parameters of reasonable debate. We inject radical ideas into that conversation and make them not be radical anymore, but make them be common sense. Unless we are capable of playing on that field and pushing that new boundary of what's reasonable debate and who gets a say on what is and is not the economy and what's sensible, then we can easily have, you know, an independent Scotland that would just be another neoliberal state like most of them. But I think there is an opportunity for us to construct that other state, to use, you know, building through the media, building through culture, building through our society, a sense that another Scotland is possible, that we don't have to just accept the same economic model as Westminster has been forcing on most of the world, to be honest, for the last few hundred years. And that's an exciting project, I think, and with recent events, as we were hearing earlier, possibly needs rapid acceleration. So I look forward to spending the next few years building that project with you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Next up, we have Hilary Wainwright, co-editor of Red Pepper magazine.
Okay, comrades and friends, thanks very much. And although I come from south of the border, I feel a bit like Adam too, that I want to be part of building this project too, because when Kat said, you know, the British state is kind of nearing its end, you know, my heart leapt. And I because it's just because of you, you know, there's a sense in which, you know, I mean, the British state is quite hollow and it's quite discredited. I mean, the fact that the Cameron government was elected on only 36% or 36% of the electorate didn't vote. You know, that's, and I think he was elected on something like 24% of the vote, or the potential vote, the electorate, you know, is a sign of a very hollow democracy. And in a way, it's Scotland that's kind of, it's kind of, that's blown the whistle on it and has begun to kind of undermine those foundations that will kind of bring the whole house down. At least that's what I hope. So I make a great effort to be connected to Rick and to come. In fact, I've just come this morning from South Africa, so I'm a little bit dazed and my voice projection might be a bit weak, but I was determined to come because I just think what you're doing is so important for what the left, the democratic left across the UK and across Europe is doing. And, you know, so I want to collaborate and see how we can spread the message south of the border and push those foundations. In a way, as these walls have been constructed, I thought, wow, you know, what if institutions could be just kind of moved, you know, and sort of shuffled like this? But I'll come a bit more at the end towards alternatives. I won't be talking so much about the media. I'll be talking more about the state and particularly Parliament, because in a way the whole experience of the MPs, the majority of MPs, kind of reacting to Corbyn's electoral mandate, not electoral mandate, his mandate in the party, the fact that members, the majority of members, the overwhelming majority of members supported him, and they talk as if that was meant absolutely nothing. And you think, and so what is it about these MPs? Where do they feel their power is that leads them to be so completely impervious to party democracy? I mean, we are a party system. We're not the old sort of 18th century kind of democracy where people voted for, you know, their squire or their, you know, the kind of individual that was powerful in their community. Parties were formed as a result of democratic processes, the extension of the franchise. And so when people vote, they're voting mainly for the party. So when these MPs sort of stand on their high horse and say, you know, we've got a mandate of millions of people, you know, and and Corbyn has only got a mandate of members, you know, let alone, I mean, it was nearly 500,000. You know, that it's just not the same categories. You know, actually, you know, it is a party democracy. So those MPs, you know, are acting in a very arrogant way. Anyway, I won't go on about that now, but I wanted to look at what that revealed about Parliament, because I think it is moments when the existing power structures are being challenged that you get kind of quick photographs of the actual power structures at work. So I wanted to consider, inspired a bit, or the opposite of inspired, sort of, you know, stimulated, challenged by the Corbyn experience with the MPs, to look at that experience, and also to look at the fact that that's not new, and that when I did this Labour Party, A Tale of Two Parties, which seems somehow rather prescient now, but that was in 87. Well, it was published in 87, but it was in the early 80s when there was the whole reselection process, and the reactions there, as I'll go on to say, were very much the same. So it's a structural problem we've got in the reaction of MPs to extra-parliamentary struggle. And then I thought I'd quickly look at what the whole opposition to Tony Benn revealed, particularly there about, in a way, it was really not so much Westminster, it's almost like City, Whitehall, Westminster. So what was revealed there was the importance of the sort of City Treasury Westminster axis. So just briefly, just maybe start with the reselection thing, because it just brings out this sort of structural problem of the dominance of Parliament, and the fact that Parliament isn't understood as about democracy, but actually about the state and the power of the state in Parliament. But I'll come on to explaining that just after describing it. So when it was in 75, there was a local party in Newham that voted to sack its MP, Reg Prentice, who was an extremely corrupt, everybody knew, he was part of the sort of East End mafia and, totally corrupt, totally reactionary. And this was widely understood. But anyway, the local constituency party there decided that, he should go. I mean, and requested him to retire at the next election. And I describe how all hell broke loose. The day before, the majority of the PLP had sent a letter to the constituency accusing the Newham party of betraying the principles of tolerance and free speech, for which our movement has also always fought when it voted to sack Prentice. And after the decision, Harold Wilson threatened at a meeting of the party's national executive that if this sort of thing continues, the PLP will have to put up its own candidates. And overnight, those who wanted Prentice to go were described as extremists, bedsit revolutionaries, members of the Trotskyist militant. Seems that's like the kind of catch-all, momentum, constituency parties in Newham. Everybody who challenges an MP is a member of the Trotskyist militant, unrepresentative of the Labour voter, and enemies of democracy. These descriptions with the term hard left added as a useful catch-all have stuck for any group in the Labour Party which challenges the established political order. So then I went in to find out who were the people that were being described in this way in Newham North East. I won't go into detail at all, but there were people like Harold Lugg, a retired milkman, and Connie Clements in her 70s, strong defender of young people joining the party. They were just ordinary Labour Party members. There might have been one young socialist who might have been a trot, but basically it was Labour Party members who just had enough of an MP who ignored them, took them for granted, and just sort of feathered his own nest. And then we have the same kind of situation with Corbyn now, that the MPs, they describe any kind of challenge as coming from Trotskyists, from militant. There's no recognition of the mass of members that are feeling that there's got to be a democratisation of the party. And you talk to MPs and they become almost sort of religious about Parliament, which is a kind of clue to what's going on. They'll say, well, they all say Jeremy's a wonderful person, lots of integrity, a nice person, and then their voice sort of lowers and say, but you've got to remember the Labour Party is a parliamentary party, and he doesn't have the trust of his MPs, all his MPs. And thinking about this, I turned to Ralph Miliband's book. I don't know if most people here might have looked at it already. It's well worth reading now. It's in a way, in this kind of atmosphere where you've got a kind of level of hysteria and sort of, you've got MPs, lords sort of skipping from studio to studio, sort of, just fueling a kind of fire of inflammatory sort of attacks on Corbyn and on members. And at one level, it's gossip. It's will they, won't they split? Who's saying what? But at another level, it's always talked about as a fundamental issue for the future of the Labour Party. Will the Labour Party survive? And so, in this atmosphere, to read his book, which is very very elegantly written, very sort of calm, you sort of think, oh, wonderful, I must study this. And he has makes a very important distinction between sort of Parliament, seeing the need for legislation and a democratic legislature on the basis of one person, one vote, and parliamentarism. And I'll just quote. He says, "The leaders of the Labour Party have always rejected any kind of political action, such as industrial action for political purposes, beyond the framework and conventions of the parliamentary system. The Labour Party has not only been a parliamentary party, it has been a party deeply imbued by parliamentarism." And I think that the key to this is the Labour Party's deference to the British state, its unwillingness, even from at the very beginnings. I mean, Ralph talks about how in its founding manifesto, Labour and the New Social Order, there was no commitment to any kind of constitutional reforms that would have democratised the British state. And that sort of deference to the British state is sort of built into the Labour Party. And it's sort of encapsulated in this oath that MPs make to the Crown, which, you can sort of dismiss as a bit of a joke. I mean, it links a bit to the Corbyn's unwillingness to sing the national anthem. But actually, what that oath to the Crown really is, it's an oath to the state, the Crown in Parliament, in the British political system, with its unfinished democratic revolution. The fact that in the end the Crown was brought back. Okay, Charles might have been beheaded, and that sounds very radical, but in the end there was the Restoration, and the Crown had a role in Parliament, the royal prerogative, the fact that war can be declared, that I think even people are talking about Theresa May is saying that she's going to use the royal prerogative to avoid a parliamentary debate about Brexit. But basically, it's a symbol of how centralised the British state is. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. And how, in a way, Parliament has got no real powers of making that state accountable. That oath to the Crown is an oath to the state. And this is what makes MPs feel powerful. They are, in effect, part of the British state. And they also have a sort of reflected glamour of royalty. I don't know, my dad used to be an MP. Well, he was an MP. And I always noticed, he was a wonderful guy, but he would always, when we went on walks and bumped into people, not people he knew, but just sort of local types, as it were, he would always slightly stoop, like, how are you, kind of young man, how's things, sort of slightly, this slightly, superior presumption of MPs. And I think the point about Corbyn is that he might have, well, he did make that oath, but his daily practice was always an oath to the people. I mean, any other European country, any kind of normal formally democratic country, the MPs make an oath to the people. I mean, that obviously doesn't always mean much, if you think about the corruption in Greece and so on. But still, it's there as a sort of formal commitment that the MPs are servants and representatives of the people. And Corbyn kind of did that in practice. I think we all know that his whole way of working as an MP was all the time to be a kind of voice and a champion of different struggles of the people. And now that he's been elected by the mass of members, there's that sort of commitment to that extra parliamentary voice, that extra parliamentary movement. And in a sense, his stubbornness, people talk about, but actually his courage, his sort of ability to stand up to that pressure, which, people who been in on parliamentary party meetings say that it's absolutely appalling. They just they just say to him at these these parliamentary meetings, you're hopeless, you're incompetent, just kind of a kind of bullying, really, which he's withstood. But I think he's withstood it not just because he's, a man of principle and courage and determination, but because he knows he's got that support from outside Parliament. He's got that commitment to representing not just party members, but people who are struggling, whether in their daily lives or on a wider public scale, people who are struggling for the kind of values that he cares for, for social justice, democracy, peace, and so on. And so, when he, for example, symbolised by, he went from a parliamentary party where he was just being attacked from every quarter to Parliament Square, where there were 10,000 people, 10,000 members, giving him support, wishing him well, telling him to retain that commitment. And I think the other thing that's interesting is that, in a way, that that oath to the state, it kind of separates MPs from each other. I mean, MPs are intensely competitive because they're sort of competing for the patronage of the state, and this has often meant that the left too is very, it's quite divided. It's not really a cohesive force. And what's impressive about the Corbyn sort of regime is actually how close the leadership of the Corbyn group in Parliament is. Diane Abbott, John McDonnell. Whenever you hear them talk about Jeremy, it's all kind of really supportive. It's almost like being in the women's movement. It's sort of not a competitive, sort of situation which happened. I mean, even Tony Benn, who was a wonderful, an amazing leader, but he was too very parliamentarist in a way. He kind of formally believed in popular democracy, but he also believed in Parliament, and he wasn't really a monarchist, but I've got almost the way through. Okay, so anyway, so that's enough. I mean, so there I'm talking really about the importance of Parliament as a crucial, part of the power structure. It's not a force for democracy. It's a path. It's an institution that reinforces the power of the executive, and that means also the power of multinationals, the power of the city, the power of all the extra parliamentary pressures from capital, which are completely secret and opaque, and which Parliament has got no real powers to expose and to unravel. And so the other example I was coming to, which was Tony Benn, which I'll just give very briefly, but basically, he tried to carry out an industrial policy which was based on the skills and knowledge and power of working class people who he believed had the energies and the commitment to retain and build British industry in the interest of the people. He was radicalised by the occupation in UCS. That actually completely changed his life, and from then on he was determined as minister to bring shop stewards into the state, into Whitehall, to discuss alternatives and so on. Lots of really good examples came out of that. But the civil service was absolutely beside themselves. Certainly the city worked with the Treasury to ensure that Harold Wilson got rid of him and got rid of any sort of ounce of radical strategy. So just very quickly, because I've got about 3 seconds, if that, on alternatives, which brings me to the alternative media. So, I mean, crucial, obviously, is reform of the political structures, and crucial to me, is proportional representation, to open up Parliament, to open up a party system in which the main parties are utterly devoted and deferential to the British state. And I think in England there's the beginnings of a real interest in this. At the Momentum World Transformed event at the Labour Party conference, one of the biggest sessions was on proportional representation. So I think things are moving very slowly. But in the absence of that, and in the absence of, therefore, radical parties of the left, in England at any rate, I mean, you've got a better situation here, another sign of how Scotland is the key. Then at least us in Red Pepper felt that we'd got to keep a way keep a voice, keep a kind of political movement that wasn't necessarily a party, but was a movement of debate, of ideas, that was linking extra-parliamentary to parliamentary, so it was not wholly inside the Labour Party, it was outside and in social movements. So that's why we formed Red Pepper, in a sense, as a political project that saw the media, in a way, another form of representation. So taking that notion of representation as a cultural political fact, rather than only a parliamentary fact, and creating a form of media, which I'm not saying Red Pepper's like the bee's knees. We need all the allies we can get, like Open Democracy and New Internationalist. And so it's part of a sort of a radical communications infrastructure, which I think is crucial to preparing the way for the institutional change that we'd like to be like moving the walls here, but that won't happen unless there's a really powerful movement against the vested interests that we're up against. So, sorry to go on.
Very much, Hilary. I know it's like 10 to 12, this is only supposed to go until 15:15, but we started a bit late, so I think we can probably, for space for questions, we can probably go on a bit, if you're all happy with that. So I think that, thanks Adam and Hilary, I think that sets the scene really well. What's been interesting in Scotland, we've had IndieRef, we've seen that massive change, that huge political engagement, and how that's then changed the media, and it's created a new media in Scotland that's played a really vital role. And for what we're seeing in England, I'm really interested to see how that might translate in England, whether you start to see the rise of similar things down there. And I think we're seeing that maybe with things like the Canary, which I'm sure you're starting to see coming up on your social media feeds now. But these are basically reactions to people who are so frustrated with what they feel is a very imbalanced media. So I think Mike's going to talk a bit more about the actual media side and what's going on in Scotland, and maybe a bit about what's going on elsewhere.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much to Rick for hosting this. It feels really important. I'm not going to speak for very long because I think at this conference it's really important for us to have discussion and time for that. So I'm going to be quite brief. In thinking about the media, I think we should remember and recognise that we wouldn't be in this Brexit fiasco if it wasn't for 30 years of racist incitement by the tabloid press in England and Britain. That is a fact, that is a reality that is documented. And this week, the Times published a cartoon which you might have seen of the Corbyn ship with Captain Corbyn, ship ahoy, with a ship of immigrants. It's a disgusting image that is beyond the pale in satire or cartoon work in the British media, and it tells us something about where we are. The political and the media elite is one. When we start talking about the media, we need to recognise that fact. They are not separable. In Scotland, we have a one-dimensional critique of our media. We talk about it being unionist, and we constantly go on about the bias in the BBC and in the media and it being unionist. Of course it is unionist, that is its role and its purpose, but it's also structurally misogynist and corporate. It represents corporate interests, and we need to go beyond this one-dimensional analysis of our media. But more than that, it's infantilist. It treats us as children. This week, I think the third chair of the child sex abuse inquiry had to stand down, and Radio Scotland ran a lengthy feature on that day about Sooty and Sweep. This was a supposed news programme for adults. This is journalism, this is a disgrace, this cannot be allowed to continue. This is not a news programme. This is supposed to be our public broadcaster, and it's a disgrace. This offers several challenges for us in the alternative media who need to go on and develop and mature. I'd say that there are three challenges. One, we need consolidation. We need to be more powerful and we need to be more united. Secondly, we need more collaboration, and I think there's some exciting opportunities in the coming weeks and months that we can see. We're really proud to be collaborating with Phantom Power, who are producing a series of films called Perspective, which will be a new bar for quality alternative film media. But thirdly, in Scotland, not just critique and challenge Westminster as an entity. Angela mentioned new developments in England, and we're really pleased to be speaking next, launching a project called The Eclipse, which is an alternative to the sun. And its stated aim is to take out the sun in the north of England. And I think that level of ambition needs to be shown here. I think in the wake of Hillsborough and Orgreave, the role of the sun has been revealed, and there's an opportunity for it to be removed as a source of racial hatred and incitement in our society. I think we need to realise we're not going to re-inhabit the press. It's not reformable, it's not redeemable. We're watching it collapse, and the new forms and the new alternative media is emerging and will go stronger with your support. But the idea that we're going to reform it or regulate it has been proven to be a failure. The death of the news of the world has just been replaced by hatred in other forms. So I believe not in reforming the Fourth Estate, but in reinventing the Fifth Estate, in which we are all co-creators, we are all content creators. This is a peer-to-peer medium in which you are going to write the news and you are going to contribute to the media. This is a completely different model from top-down, here is the news. This is us sharing our visions and our stories of the world. This is about a shift from being passive British subjects to being active Scottish citizens. And it's one I want to go with you on. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thank you to all of our speakers. So I'm going to just open it up to the floor straight away, and we'll see if we've got some questions, or it doesn't even need to be questions. If you've got a quick contribution, something that you want to say about what's going on in the media right now, or any ideas that you have, we're always really keen to hear them if we've got people working in the new media. So on you go. Got a man up the back here. If you can shout so everyone can hear you.
I just want to come back to what Adam said about Ramsay. The thing about the media, sometimes we think the media is the problem, but I would say that the media is the voice, it's the mouthpiece of the power elite, right? It's showering us with common sense, which is about us being passive recipients of capitalism, war, imperialism, sexism, homophobia, etc. So I think the idea about new radical forms of the Fifth Estate, all that, I think it's really fantastic, but it has to be where the media is kind of co-created with the politics, the policy, and both suffer. So I think media is extraordinarily important because it reaches out further than our door knocking and campaigning was able to do, and we have to get in there and fight for an alternative left radical version, but it has to be coupled with the political organizing, political activity, and the policies that are different, so that we are talking about these things, not talking about the media and critiquing the media, but we're broadcasting a positive vision for the future. I think that's what made the Yes campaign so successful, and that has to be, I think, at the heart of any successful radical left alternative media.
Yeah. So it's kind of just to not just be critiquing bad media all the time, but just to be doing it better from the beginning.
And a positive voice of what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. This gentleman here, I'll come to you next.
Could I just, I would like to suggest that by the time we get home this afternoon, the images and the voices from this conference will be stored on computers in Cheltenham. By this afternoon, images and voices from this conference, and some of them, after the filter, will be shared by other agencies of the British state by tomorrow. And this is not new. The media in this country has been, particularly the new media, the cyber media, under the control of a military-industrial complex, because it was the military that established cyber communication. This came out of the Cold War, where the military and the British state managed the media under Cold War politics. But it went further than that. For over 200 years, the British state managed the struggle for anti-colonialism. They managed that process. They prevented anti-imperialism. They fought against using media through agencies of the British state, particularly in Ireland, and in India, and of course throughout Africa. My question therefore is, to what extent do you see the power of agencies within the British state preventing the new media from being effective? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with you, Mike. We'll go on the train. No pressure.
Well, hello, Cheltenham. I think that we should be aware of the role of the British state, but I think we should also be wary of being too conspiratorial about it and too obsessive about that. I believe in the best security is just openness, open meetings. I don't believe in cadres and secret names and behind closed doors. We are open, we're an open democratic movement. If the British state wants to spy on radical movements, which it has and will do, there is nothing we can do about that. We can protect ourselves digitally by having backups and mirrors and protect our sites from attack. But beyond that, I think we can be conscious, but I think we should go on with our work.
I agree with Mike. I did a big research project late last year and early this year into how activists across the UK responded to surveillance by the state. And one of the things that amazed me was I did a bunch of interviews in Scotland, and a lot of people seem to think that the suggestion that the state might be spying on activists was a kind of tinfoil hat type thing, you know, conspiracy theorist type thing someone would say, when we know fine well that, you know, British state was willing to infiltrate kind of fluffy environmental movements and spend millions of pounds on police officers to, you know, and so on. So I think it's a very important question to ask. How do you respond to the, you know, very likely fact that a movement is infiltrated to an extent by the state, that it's being spied on, you know, through online and offline mechanisms by the state and so on? And I think the response, though, has to be exactly as Mike says, that you have open meetings, that you know, organise in public. You don't have to be ashamed of what we're trying to do. So, I mean, to answer the specific question, how much is the British state trying to undermine online media? I work for a global website. We have been, you know, banned in China at times, banned in Iran. We've been under electronic attack from people in Russia magically when we write things they don't like and so on. So it's certainly a thing that happens. I don't think that's how the British state tends to operate. I don't mean it operates, you know, in positive ways, but I don't think it operates in that way, and that's not normally our experience of it. What it's much better at doing is co-opting people and making people feel very excited that they get to sit in a room with all the spies and then write stories about them. And they're very good at co-opting the mainstream media, and I expect that they'll get better and better at co-opting online media too. And you need to be aware of that. You know, they're very good at making it feel like good journalism consists of going into MI6 and being told what to say, and we need to resist that absolutely.
Do you want to speak?
Okay, just add, although I've spoken enough, but so I agree with both of you, and I just add two things. One, in a way, it links to the other question about linking media with political struggle, but in a way, doing that, which you do, in a way, that's in a way the point of peer-to-peer media, because it's coming from people in struggle and engaged. But I mean, that's a force against co-option of the media. I think the other thing is to, as well as to be open and stimulate debate and so on, we've got to really support exposés of the sort of secret state. So never be fearful of actually exposing what the state, what you're describing, and including supporting whistleblowers like Philip Snowden and Chelsea Manning and so on. And WikiLeaks, you know, and Assange, and so we've got to be also protecting those that are willing to whistleblow, which is a crucial part of, you know, the secret state. I mean, part of the struggle against the secret state is whistleblowing from within it.
Mm-hmm. That's one reason why people should pay attention to the IP bill, I think, as well, actually, because the powers that police and the state will have and have used already to spy on journalist sources is really, really worrying, because that prevents whistleblowers coming out, that prevents exposing those power structures if people feel like they're going to have those kinds of repercussions that we've seen for Chelsea Manning and for Edward Snowden and for Julian Assange. So keep an eye on the IP bill. I don't think enough people are interested in that. We think common space, there's a lot of stuff around that, and you tend to find that the traffic on it isn't really that high. I don't think people are making the connections there. And that was a Theresa May thing as well, I think, with the IP bill, who's now our Prime Minister. This gentleman here, you were next.
Thanks. I agree with what's been said so far. If you're going to get involved in radical activities, you have to expect to be spied upon, and if you don't want to be spied up, don't get involved. But to me, the flip side of it is I'd like to be able to do a wee bit of spying myself. I'd like to find out what PricewaterhouseCoopers are actually up to. Not just points you've made, but to actually be able to hear what they're saying and find out what they're doing. How we do that is a discussion, I think. But I'd also be interested to hear from the panel and others, what sort of programmatic activities could we get involved with that would actually start to create this wider populace of people are co-creating the media and the news stories, and questioning and asking in it. It does seem to be that one of the kind of focal things for a lot of the new media is this strange notion of the digital native, which is for many people discredited, but still pops up as if it's a fact of right. So it'd be interesting to hear how we would actually go about getting more people involved, getting more people taking part in the common space, which I think is a great idea, and not simply doing the other slot that's often put against social media users. They sit in the house and they click buttons and they don't go and vote. So how do you actually marry up and link together people's communicative behaviour as part of politics and the political behaviour, the demonstrations, supporting for trade union activities, supporting old people who are stuck in care homes. You know, I hear a lot in the radical movements going to young people, and it's great to hear it. There are a lot of older people who are having a really shitty time because they're dumped into substandard care homes, which are there for the profit very often, or they run them. And if Common Space are looking to be campaign and you're not ready to touch care homes, go.
One thing I will say, from Common Space's perspective on that, of how you can join those things up, Common Social is one of the ways we're trying to do that, which is a social network, and it's kind of bringing together, it's merging the idea of media and activism. And so that's an interesting concept that I have never seen before in any other media model. So there are efforts to do it, but these things can be quite difficult to do.
This event's on that.
Yep, so there you go. So that's one way. Hilary, you've been in media for quite a long time. I mean, how do you think that the new digital landscape that we have presents opportunities to do that in a way that maybe didn't exist before? Where it's not just about reporting, but it's actually about pulling those things together.
It sort of instinctively leads people to act in this sharing way. It's almost a culture, really. You know, the tools kind of, I'm not saying automatically produce a social activity, but because they're there and people want to communicate when they've been involved in a struggle or they've seen some, injustice, they picture it, they comment on it. There's a sort of automatic sharing, sort of peer-to-peer co-production, which I think the more not established, but the more long-lived left media must respond to quickly. Certainly, it's shaken up Red Pepper and made us much more open. I mean, we've always been open in our intentions, but it's made it more practical. I think it's also a sort of stimulus to cooperation, because in a way, the social media, the new technology makes copying just automatic. So people are copying and republishing, and then that leads to, face-to-face collaboration and debates and more cross-fertilisation of ideas.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, listen, I'm going to, because I can see other hands going up, so I'm going to maybe just take like 2 or 3 questions if we have them, and then we'll see who the panel wants to come back to. I see some hands down here. There's a right. So I'll take the question from you, sir, and then there's 2 hands down here in the front, and the gentleman behind, and I will try and get to everyone else as well. So if we'll take your question first, and then we'll take your questions next, come back to the panel, okay?
Addressing the issue of effectiveness of alternative media, we might look at that from 2 perspectives. One is reach, and the other is authority. Reach, it's fairly obvious. How do we get out to people? How do we engage with people? The second is perhaps more problematic. How do we gain that authority? How do we counterbalance the weight of the existing mainstream establishment, print and broadcast media, reach and authority?
Okay, thank you. Lady in front row we'll go to next.
This is less of a question, more of a comment about using secure communications and things like that. This is something that's built into the RIC constitution at the moment. It's how we organise. We need to organise in the open, obviously, but there are tools there to protect our privacy. It's not about being conspiratorial, but it's about modelling the fact that everybody has a right to privacy. So there's lots of tools. RiseUp.net is secure email for activists. We use RiseUp lists for our communications in RIC. We don't need to make it easy for the government to spy on us. You can use VPNs, you can use encryption. Signal is a really, really good app that you can use. If the radicals aren't developing and using these new tools, who's going to use them? As Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So, it's a balance between being open and being honest and knowing that, there's probably mold in here, whatever, But we can also use and develop good tools for privacy.
Thanks very much. I'd love to see more workshops actually showing people how they can use those tools, because that...
Yeah.
At the last National Forum, LSE planned to have a workshop on tech tools in January.
Okay.
Yeah, there was one in February as well.
Yep. So that might be that. I would find that really useful, and even I work in media, and I'm still not sure how to use these tools. So that would be really good. The man just behind there.
Hilary reminded us about how well Ralph Miliband understood Labour and how well he understood Parliament. It doesn't say much for his parenting skills. And I guess the question is, what if someone like Ralph Miliband could produce the Millie brothers, what was it about the British establishment structures which created them, since they weren't created in the half? Was it just Oxford?
Okay, right. Listen, let's go to reach and authority. Open Democracy and Bella Caledonia are online only. Is that right?
Yep.
You're online only.
Yep.
So how do you deal with the issue of? I mean, we know that the new media, as generous as everybody has been in keeping it afloat, we still struggle very much financially, and that affects our ability to increase that reach. So how do you get around that, and how do you command the authority that, whether we like it or not, the mainstream still does have?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a dilemma that we have at Open Democracy quite a lot. We publish sort of mostly quite sort of longish, 1,000-wordish essays doing political analysis. When we survey our readers, we find we have a lot of authority. Like, people say they get their opinions from us, they trust us, they use arguments they've heard, they've read on us in discussions with others, and so on. We've got endless authority, and as a result, less reach than others. And that's a decision we take. We choose to publish sort of authoritative. I mean, obviously we try and make them well written so people can read them, and we like it when they go widely, when they spread widely. But I suppose for me, Angela gave the example earlier of the Canary, and I guess I'd say they're at the opposite end of that spectrum. They have a huge reach, but frankly, I don't trust them. When I do fact check their stories, they're normally not true, and that is a very difficult tension. And for me, how you create an alternative media that people don't think of as something odd over there that you don't get authority, it doesn't tell you something authoritative, but which isn't also like talking bollocks. It is important, and I don't know the answer to the question. If I did, then you would all read all of our content all the time and also believe everything it says, and it wouldn't just be one of me here. There'd be, we have a massive staff team, so it's a difficult question. If anyone knows the answer, then do give me a shout.
Mike, you Bella Caledonia publishes similar. It can be really kind of long think pieces at times. How do you deal with the issue of reach?
Well, I got lambasted early in the year for saying what I thought was a basic truth, that a lot of the pro-indie websites basically talk to themselves. Their readership is self-confirmation. You go on it and you get told what you already believe and you think, that's great. That's a largely pointless exercise. We could do this eternally. We wouldn't shift anybody. We'd feel great about ourselves. So the issue of reach, excuse me, is really important. And one thing we're going to do in the coming month is we've established a person to do a database, a network for women writers, because we think there's a gender issue here about reach. Male writers still dominate in the alternative media. There's nothing particularly alternative about that. And we know that when women write for us, more women comment, more women participate. We know that online is an arena of abuse for a lot of people who are put off engaging. So I think there's a gender issue to the question of reach, and we're trying to address that by establishing a database of writers. But it is absolutely imperative that the pro-independence alternative media get a grip on the fact that a lot of the time they are talking to themselves. That's not an insult, that's not a terrible criticism, it's not to demean other people's good. It's a simple reality. And so I think that's two areas where we need to really change the model in terms of reach. In terms of authority, all you can do is be credible and build up that authority as the authority of the existing media collapses. It is quite dangerous, though, if people's belief in media just collapses and isn't replaced with anything. You get into a sort of nihilism where you end up believing in chemtrails and just kind of disappear into conspiracy land if you don't believe anything and don't believe that anybody has any integrity. So that authority has to come from integrity of the people within the movement.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Someone very, very keen to speak here in the front row.
I find it all really exciting, alternative media, I've been following it for a long time. What I am kind of concerned about, as a number of people, is that we start to suffer from the same problems as mainstream media, where we have to discern what is news and what is opinion piece, because it's great, you know, getting all of your opinions, you know, I love them, but if you're going to have a credible alternative, we need to have investigative journalism with actual news to report. And obviously there's a dilemma there because that costs money, and it's how do we get around that? You know, do we have local reporters? Or?
Yeah, say a question for everyone here just before we go to answering that quick, because that is a good point. There is a big difference between news and opinion, but the problem is that creating good news stories costs money, it needs resources, and people need to be paid to do it as a job. You can't really do that in your free time. You need a wage to do that, and it should be a good wage. It should be something you can sustain a decent living on. So, put your hands up if you read new media outlets. If you read a new media outlet, one of the digital ones, any of them, regularly, put your hands up. Fairly regularly. And then put your hands up. And then put your hands up if you fund any of them. Put your hands up if you don't fund any of them. And that's a big issue for us. Sometimes Common Space could have, like, in one of our best months, we had nearly 200,000 unique users a month. If a fraction of those people were to donate a £5 a month to Common Space, we'd be in a very different position than we're in. It is a big issue about money, finance, and then how it's easy to produce opinion, and I think that's one of the reasons we see so much of this in mainstream media now as well, is it actually is just cheaper to produce opinion pieces, and it kind of fills the void of news that's been disappearing now for years. So what's the answer to that question? Hilary, how do you feel about that?
Well, I just got one thought, which is we get a lot of reports from people, you know, in the middle of struggles or just having seen something going on that they know to be false, and then they write to us, and they've not written it in a way which is very accessible. You know, it just needs a bit of work. So that I think sometimes it's a matter of funding, not so much for investigative journalism, but more for really sympathetic and good editors to kind of make full use of all the knowledge and insight and sort of information that there is amongst the mass of readers. So it's kind of trying to work through Mike's point about a more sharing, sort of less top-down media, and work out what are the sort of material conditions for that. Because I think it does mean a new breed of editors, really.
Yeah, I think that is a good, because we do that with Common Space quite a lot. Some of our news actually comes from just helping other people to take what they know is going on and put that into a journalistic format and sort of tick the boxes of what good journalism would be. But Open Democracy, I mean, it's quite analytical pieces you do rather than news as well.
So we mostly do analysis. We do, I mean, I think this illustrates the story in a way. I have a colleague who is a full-time investigative journalist, and she works particularly on things around sort of detention centres, G4S, that kind of world, and mostly when there's a story comes out about G4S, it's her that's done the work on it. So you've got her and you've got me, and I can publish 3 stories a day from me writing comment pieces and more commissioning people sending things in and so on. She publishes maybe about 1 story a month. Now she works probably harder than I do. It's just that to get one solid story exposing what G4S is doing in this children's home in Doncaster or whatever it is takes as long as as a month in which I can publish a few hundred pieces. And that is just the nature of journalism. And I do agree with Hilary that there's also an important function in supporting people who want to tell their own stories, and that is the thing we need to invest in more. But that kind of hard investigative journalism, G4S staff are not going to come forward and say, yeah, I did kind of kill that kid, normally. Which is the kind of story she exposes. It's because she's there being paid, and there's only, we can only afford to pay one of her, and that's just one company she basically deals with almost all the time. And the question was asked earlier about we should be spying on PwC. Well, that is the job of investigative journalists. That's exactly what investigative journalists should be doing. But there's no one doing that because, as everyone said, it's much. As a journalistic model, it's much cheaper to pay people to do what I do, which is writing comment analysis, than it is to pay people to do what Claire does, which is producing maybe 1 story a month, doing investigation. But what she does is much more valuable because I've got nothing to comment on, unless there's someone exposing the facts. There was a study a few years ago, and I'm sure this is worse now, but which showed that 95% of online content, like discussion sites, blogs, etc., was based on news stories gathered by the 3 main global news agencies. Which means that even the most radical comment you got, the basic facts on which they were basing their opinion, the news which was driving that agenda, was being gathered by these 3 massive corporations. That's a massive problem.
Yeah. Mike, you will maybe make this the last contribution because time is marching on, but you run a commentary website. Do you think in the new media that we are guilty as well as mainstream of blurring that line between news and opinion?
Well, I think that Common Space and the Ferret are an essential part of that landscape because they focus more on news. And I think that there's a role for comment and opinion analysis because we are overwhelmed with information. And comment does serve a purpose in offering some filter and some explanation, which is essential. Otherwise, we just get a deluge of that information. So I think, as I said before, collaboration and consolidation is key. And sitting next to the content that you provide in news and the Ferret, which needs support as well, provides that. But I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both that will enrich us.
We at Common Space, we decided to focus solely on news. So our in-house team, it's me and 3 journalists. None of us write any opinion or analysis kind of stuff for Common Space. The in-house paid team only do news, and the opinion stuff that you see on Common Space, that's completely from contributors. We don't commission it because we don't have a freelance budget to pay for it. So it's really basically if you want to have a say on what's going on, then the platform is there to use. So I think within the new media, a lot of the things that have been brought up, there are efforts all of us are making here to try and address them, but it's just within very restricted circumstances a lot of the time. But it's definitely, I think, from all the contributions that we've heard and from what you can see on your laptops or your smartphones when you go online, things have changed dramatically when it comes to the media landscape because of digital, and I don't think that that's going to change. I think it's going to continue to evolve, and the exciting thing for us is how we can use those tools to try and create a fairer, more balanced media landscape. So thank you very much to the panel. Round of applause again for everyone. very much, everyone, for attending this session. I hope you got something from it. I'm told by Jonathan that even though the sessions have gone on a little bit later because it was running behind schedule, they are aiming to come back into the hall for 1 o'clock. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Sorry to go on at the beginning. I was just a bit down.
So that's the end of the first session, folks. I'm sorry we managed to miss the beginning. This was a technical hiccup with the YouTube event that was set up. But we should be back in this room after lunch. I'll just update you of what will be on this particular stream. I hope you can hear me okay. It's obviously quite noisy in the room. Come on, device. Here we go. So this room, on this stream, we'll have Advancing Scotland Lands Revolution, and that will be back, I believe, at 2 p.m-ish. So until then, I shall pause the stream. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks now.
Sort of traditionally seen as land reform because it's not about changing who the owner is, it's not about redistributing land or restoring land to someone else. As you see in other jurisdictions in relation to restoring land to other people, like you see that in places like South Africa, who are post-apartheid, they're actually sort of giving land back to people where there's been a recognised historical wrong. In Scotland, though, we have been doing a bit of redistribution. Since 2003, we had the Land Reform Scotland Act, which introduced a rural community right to buy or a right of first refusal, which allowed communities to like that asset. I'm going to try and bid for that in 2005. You've also got, in the 2003 legislation, a crofting community right to buy, which is a stronger right, which allows you to force a sale to the crofting community, whether or not the landowner wishes to sell or not. That's been used once in anger, in terms of a landowner sort of going to court and resisting it, but it's also been used in the background as a sort of stick to wave at people to go, actually, if you don't consent to this buyout process, we can go to court. And there's been a voluntary sale in places like Galson and in South Uist in the Western Isles. Those rights are now starting to percolate, or rights like them are starting to percolate into urban Scotland. We've now got the community empowerment legislation from 2015 widened the right of first refusal to urban areas, so communities have a right to register an interest over certain strategic assets and say, I want that. And we've had the first example of that very recently in Portobello in Edinburgh, where a church has been lined up for communities to register an interest and say, I want that. We've also now got, again, with the Community Empowerment Act, this is not quite in force yet, but it will be early next year, we think. Communities will have a right to acquire certain land that has been abandoned, neglected or environmentally mismanaged. That's a big change because you're introducing this element of compulsion, which has only existed in relation to crofting land in the Highlands and Islands up until then. And also there's going to be a right to buy land to further sustainable development, and this is in Part 5 of the newest Land Reform Act, the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016. You've now got to mention the year because we've got 2 Land Reform Acts. So that's all the sort of community acquisition stuff. We've also got going on at the same time, there's been the private tenancies, I can't remember the exact name of the most recent legislation, but that brings in this new form of residential tenancy to Scotland, which we'll hear about no doubt in relation to the living rent stuff. There's also questions about what to do with derelict urban land and whether there might be compulsory sale orders, there might be nice issues about taxation, how to sort of value assets in terms of compulsory purchase. So you are starting to, as I say, some land reform is coming to urban areas, but there might yet be more to happen. So no doubt that will come up in the conversation. I think I've spoken for around about my 7 minutes there. I'm inclined to pass on and let others speak, and then there'll be more time for questions. But I hope that's a bit of a flavour for everyone to lead on to the discussion from. Okay.
Thank you for that. Next, I'm going to hear from Lincoln Richford from One Lockhead.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'll sit down if I may, because I've got some notes here, and they're not as handy as your phone. But as Lindsay says, I'm from One Lockhead, and we're in the middle of a process of attempting a buyout from the Duke of Buccleuch. For us, down south, it was a big learning process because we didn't know anything about it. I mean, as Malcolm has inferred, really, all of this took place really in the Highlands and Islands, and we're quite the centre of interest because we're in the south, and also, of course, because we're dealing with the largest landowner in Scotland. Well, what I want to do is give you a kind of idea of what we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it. So perhaps start with some of the history of One Lockhead. In case you're not aware, we are the highest village in Scotland, which is a bit surprising as we're in the south. It was essentially exists because of lead mining, gold and silver, and that goes way back. But in the 15th century, the crowns and regalia of the kings of Scotland were made from gold from One Lockhead, so the area became known as God's treasure house. But more interestingly, once the Duke had taken over the land, and it appears that he actually bought it, this was around 1700, and that's when the village started to become an entity. Before that it had been camping, so this is the beginning of One Lockhead. In 1756 the miners founded a library. This was the miners themselves, it wasn't the bosses giving them a library, it was 18 men from the village, a couple of them were church ministers, and they set up the One Lockhead Library. It still exists, and if you're passing by, go and have a look, because it's an amazing place. I mean, it's got, to give you an idea, and bear in mind that the miners banned their bosses from taking part in this because they wanted to control it. You can find there a 19th century copy of the Quran. You can find Darwin's Origin of Species. So the range of books is very wide indeed. And that was a community effort. So there's a history of it. In the late 18th century, William Symington, who some of you may have heard of, I had never heard of him until I moved to One Lockhead. He works in One Lockhead, maintaining steam engines and later making his own. And he's the first man to make a steamboat. And so quite a first for One Lockhead. One Lockhead is like a miniature Scotland in a way. It's been exploited for its minerals, and we've had firsts in the world and so on. And now it's been neglected because in 1934 the mining ceased. A little flurry in the 1950s, and the major reason that we're embarked on a community buyout is because we want a future for this village. I mean, we love living there. The population now is about 200. We have about 35 children, and those children will have to leave the village when they grow up, which employs about 10 dozen people during the summer season, but that's part-time work. The Duke used to employ about 14 gamekeepers, but he's not doing that now. So there's one shepherd and one gamekeeper. So it's not what you call a thriving industrial hub. So we embarked on this buyout, and the first thing we had to do was educate ourselves as to what this meant. Because, as I said, all the expertise is up north. So we've organised a couple of trips. We went to, well, the first one actually wasn't up north, it was to the Mull of Galloway, a buyout which succeeded 3 years ago. And in that 3 years, they quite a percentage when you look at the small place. So again, that was a success, and that was our first visit, although we didn't see much of it. because it was extremely misty and wet and draining. But the important thing was we spoke to the people. We've just come back from a trip to Harris and Lewis, and 9 of us from the village. We visited the North Harris Trust and the Gorson Trust in Lewis. And this has been inspiring because these two are going back to 2004, so they've been 12 years at it. And what they've achieved in those 12 years is quite remarkable. It's a complete transformation, and as I say, inspires us to push on and try and make a success of our buyout. They have created numerous jobs that in North Harris Trust. They've got they employ 9 people themselves. They have community housing. They've created circumstances for other businesses to flourish. They have a state-of-the-art distillery that produces already famous Harris gin and the malt whisky on the way, and that's 26 jobs. So, you know, in a population of hundreds, these are big figures. And Gorson Trust was equally inspiring. So we've come back with renewed vigour. We've already had our first meeting with Buccleuch. We're talking with John Glenn, who's the CEO of what is £1 billion. It's not going to be easy, but we're not without hope, because they're not saying no, and they're going to continue to talk to us. And our first meeting, after dealing with such issues as why wasn't he included in our early consultations, because he's part of our community, we had a bit of a discussion about that and decided that no, he wasn't really part of our community. So what we did was we had a public meeting in January. We gained the necessary 10% that we needed of the village population to continue, so we formed our trust. We've since then, for about 5 months, we've been consulting with the village, and we've produced a consultation document which has in it 93 ideas from our village for what they want to do in the event of our successful buyout. So this forms the basis of us being able to go and meet with the Duke. And this we did. And from this first meeting, we got an undertaking from John Glenn to produce a traffic light system. We had given him a map of the land that we're intending to buy. And this amounts to 14,600 acres, about 23 square miles. They were rather taken aback by this, although they've got even more than that, of course. There had been some discussions about buyouts in Monarch Head in 2013, and this really had been centring just around the village itself. Whereas following our consultation with the village, which hadn't taken place in 2013, we now were looking for the areas around the village in order to make a viable community. So their initial reaction to this is that they could do this for us. We didn't need to buy the land. Buccleuch could do it for us. Well, of course, we explained to him that we were trying to move on from the days when the Duke did the things for us if he felt like it. We wanted to move on to the time when the community decided what it wanted to do. So we had a bit of a discussion, but the important thing is that we've got this traffic light system where he says he can put on this map some green lights, so that means he's willing to sell something, some amber lights, where he's probably going to try and convince us that he can do it better than we can, and he's going to put some red lights. So this is the beginning and the state of our negotiations so far. And I'd like to just point out that we've got a huge amount of support from Community Lands Scotland. We've had tremendous support. We've had from the government, Rosanna Cunningham in the Community Lands Scotland conference in Stornoway said to the conference that your newest member is One Lock Head, and we want them to succeed, and we're going to be with them all the way. So we've got some powerful friends, and that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you very much. I hope to open this discussion via Neil Gray through a more kind of urban lens. I don't think that we talk enough about land reform in the urban context, although I think that's going to begin to change. So I just wanted to, he was kind enough to send me on his, it might be my pen. He was kind enough to send me on his paper for today, so I'm just going to read a chunk of it out, really. He had focused on Glasgow, and it really kind of sets out the scene in Glasgow for why urban land reform is required. So just to jump in here, it's with a bit of context. This is the first public-private partnership in Glasgow. It's the Glasgow Eastern Renewal Project, which ran from 1976 to 1987, which was one of the first major public-private area-based regeneration projects in Europe, preceding the influential London and Merseyside Dockland redevelopment schemes by a full 6 years. Symbolic spectacles such as Glasgow's Miles Better campaign in 1983, the 1988 Garden Festival, and the 1990 European Year of Culture soon followed. Notably, Glasgow was the first old industrial city to hold the Culture Year and the first to tie explicitly to urban or cultural regeneration, in other words, sugar-coated gentrification as exemplified in the Merchant City. These high-impact events have tended to overshadow the crucial formation of Glasgow Action in 1985, the first clearly defined public-private partnership in urban Scotland. Launched as a partnership between the Scottish Development Agency and Glasgow District Council to promote a service sector economy in Glasgow and to inject private sector leadership into the growth process, it took direct inspiration from downtown urban renewal models in the old industrial Rust Belt cities in the US, ultimately contributing massively to the exacerbation of social polarities on both sides of the pond. More recently, in 2009, Glasgow City Council created City Property as an arm's-length external organisation responsible for the management, development and disposal of the Council's so-called non-operational surplus land and property assets, and the valuation, demolition and insurance of all Council properties. Bank to purchase the Council's entire commercial portfolio of 1,500 properties, including all the buildings rented from the Council. This portfolio now consists of around 2,500 assets, including shops, offices and community managed facilities, such as halls, neighbourhood centres and sports centres. The contractual obligation to pay off the private bank loan has serious implications for city property tenants. Rents have been reviewed upwards across the board and peppercorn rates have been abolished. None of this means that the state has disappeared. Instead, we have a thick state that facilitates and lubricates risk-reduced private investment through a reorientation of public subsidy away from the social redistributive ends. The Clyde Gateway Regeneration Programme, which includes major sites of the Commonwealth Games, illustrates this clearly. Another arm's-length external organisation, Clyde Gateway's primary role is to remediate derelict and contaminated land in the East End. This could be progressive, of course, but in reality upwards of £200 million of public subsidy has already been spent on expensive land remediation and decontamination almost exclusively for business, office and private housing developments. Barely any of this development is accessible to the residents of the East End whose employment, health and welfare status has been subject to degraded, derelict and contaminated land for decades. When the Games Monitor, which I don't know if you know, is the Glasgow Games Monitor, which Neil co-founded in 2014, asked Clyde Gateway what proportion of the 10,000 homes they proposed to build would be for social housing. They said they had no figures for social housing and that the majority would be for private sale, Scotland and the buy-to-let investors in the private rented sector. Right to buy and housing stock transfer have contributed massively to the reduction of social housing in Glasgow, from 61% in 1981 to less than 30% now. 81,000 council homes were transferred to the Glasgow Housing Association in 2003, the largest municipal privatisation process in Europe at the time. There are now no council homes in Glasgow, and GHA hold only 39,000 homes for social rent. At least 20,000 homes have been demolished without like-for-like replacement. People were rightly outraged by the City Council's plan to blow up the Red Road blocks in a live stream for the Commonwealth Games opening ceremony. But few knew that the Red Road flats were part of a wider mass demolition process through the Transforming Communities Glasgow scheme. Run by Glasgow City Council, GHE and the Scottish Government across 8 different social housing areas, it involves the demolition of 11,000 GHA social rented properties and the replacement by 6,500 homes for private sale and mid-market rent, and just 600 new social rented homes. That's 10,400 social rented homes lost in just one citywide scheme. So what is to be done? Despite the scale of these problems, there is very little independent tenant or resident organisation in Scotland. The Living Rent campaign, which came out of private tenants' action groups, has been one major positive development. The introduction of a tenants' union is vital and long overdue. However, there is still an urgent need for an independent social rented tenants organisation. The formerly active tenants movement has been incorporated into housing association committees, which have long been recognised as a mere fig leaf for tenant participation. Ideally, something like the Radical Housing Network in London is required that unites public, social and private tenants in a federated structure with squatter and homelessness groups, capturing the increasing complexity of housing tenure in the UK. We have to recognise that housing associations have been central to housing privatisation processes, and there is a need to make bold claims again for public and other forms of housing, which I think is a good jumping off point to hand over to Liz from the Living Rent campaign.
Hi there, thanks Lindsay. My name's Liz. I'm currently the acting chair of the Living Rent campaign and Living Rent, which is recently formed as a tenants' union. And I've got to admit, when I was asked to talk today on this panel about land reform, I was initially a little bit intimidated by it. I don't really know very much about land reform or land in Scotland, other than that the land's quite nice, and that a lot of it is owned by a small group of people who are quite powerful and wealthy, and maybe it'd be nice if that wasn't the case. That feels like the sum total of my knowledge about land in Scotland. But then I was kind of thinking about it a bit more, and I wondered if perhaps that oversimplification is really the basis of what I actually needed to know. And I thought about it a bit more and how that was so connected to power. And where sort of tenants and renters, particularly private renters, come into this. Because after all, land, property ownership, renting, it's all about power in Britain. And tenants, particularly private renters, though I think Neil's right to mention social renters in there as well, are really at the bottom of that kind of pyramid when it comes to power and influence when we're talking about land and ownership. After all, we don't even own the walls that we live in, let alone the land that those walls are built on. In fact, actually we're paying to be caretakers for someone else's asset, which is likely to be increasing. And that's the position that we're in as renters. And the proportion of people that are renting is also on the increase. And then above renters, you've got kind of homeowners who are in a better position in the terms that theoretically they own the walls, that the land that's built on the land. You know, some of them, you know, arguably they're renting the walls from the bank for a long period of time, but eventually they'll own those walls. And then above that, you've got property owners who own many properties, and some who own a few, and others who own very many more, who are profiting out of that. And above that, you've got sort of landowners, and there's a lot of, you know, interlinking between those two sort of categories. So when I started thinking about it like that, and I started thinking about how actually this issue of land reform and tenant renting and everything really is part of a bigger picture and part of this pyramid. It made me think a lot about how actually if we're to take a sort of united, wide, whole society kind of approach to this, that organising people who are at the bottom of that pyramid, who are renters, either private or social renters, that organising that group of people is actually fundamentally important. So I think that's where these things are connected, and I think that's why I'm here today. So thinking about that, that's part of the reason why I think that the Living Rent as a tenants' union is vitally important, and that's a big part of the reason why we moved from being a kind of campaign around one particular issue to being a membership organisation where renters pay membership in order to, you know, properly organise and have that kind of structure there, because I think we do need organisations, and we do need to lay the foundations for organisations which, you know, have the potential to grow and grow over years and years, because I think we do need to think about this in a long-term way as well. So that's like a bit of background, and that's kind of, I guess, me bigging up Living Rent, which is probably what I'm just going to continue to do. We've got our first AGM for members next week, so we'll be electing our first committee, and we're going to, you know, we're a tenant-owned, tenant-run organisation, and that's a really big sort of part of who we are. So I guess that was my first point that I wanted to make when I was talking about the connection between renters and land reform, that actually, if we are to take power, that, you know, the people on the bottom of that rung, who are the most powerless, are really, you know, the people that we ought to be organising. At the moment, there are more homeowners than there are renters in Scotland. So the pyramid isn't, if I was to draw it, which I can't because there's nothing to draw with, but it wouldn't quite be a pyramid shape because there's more homeowners, I think, than there are renters and social renters, but that's quite new. In Scotland, it was only in the early 2000s that home ownership overtook social renting. So, you know, private renting could and possibly will overtake home ownership in the coming years. So actually laying the foundations for this change, which we are seeing, we're starting to see, and we probably will see, is I think fundamentally important. And we are seeing things like this coming through land as well. I've just moved to Glasgow this week, but before that I lived in Edinburgh for 11 years, and, you know, sort of built this idea of Edinburgh building homes for private rent. Edinburgh City Council are talking about building homes for private rent at the moment. So this idea that land is going to be used, actually what we need to do is allow big investors to build property for people to rent privately, has increasing, you know, the Scottish Government are very into that kind of idea. So I think there's a lot of connections there as well. So that's, you know, basically me saying we need a tenants union, and that Living Rent are starting to be that, and that's exciting. Point number one. So I should probably give you a bit of background on the Living Rent and the Living Rent campaign. I'm aware that people might be quite familiar with it, but we were founded in response to a Scottish Government consultation on the Private Tenancies Bill. I think that's what it's called. I go backwards and forwards on what we're trying to remember. I think it's the Private Tenancies Bill, which was in order to create a new kind of tenancy for renters in the private rented sector. So currently, if you're a private tenant, you're on a sort of tenancy, which is a short assured tenancy, and basically in that tenancy, the landlord can evict you for any reason whatsoever. The landlord doesn't have to give a reason. You have very little security within your own home. And 2 years ago, the Scottish Government consulted on a new kind of tenancy, which would, in theory, enable tenants to have more security of tenure within their own home. So, you know, it would bring in grounds for eviction, and it would get rid of this, you know, no-fault ground. So the landlord wouldn't be able to say, well, I don't like you, you've been a bit nippy, bye-bye. It would have to have some reason, and there are various different grounds for eviction that the landlord will be able to use, and that's going to come into play. That legislation's going to, they said late 2017, but what I've heard now is early 2018. So we're watching this space on that one. But yeah, so the Living Rent campaign formed in response to that consultation, and I guess I wanted to make just sort of one point really about the campaign and what we did, and where I think it's connected to land reform. So when that consultation was released, obviously tenancy reform, not the most simple or easy to understand or digest, you know, or the easiest thing to build a campaign around. Security of tenure is absolutely vital in order for renters to organise, feel safe and comfortable in their own homes. But it's not an easy sell, it's not an easy message, and, you know, it's not a simple topic. So I guess my first point I would like to make is that, you know, part of what we did and what made our campaign quite successful was that we motivated people to respond to that consultation, but by simplifying some of the messages, and coming up with sort of three kind of key aspects, because it was a very long consultation document, and we had a lot of self-education to do as well. But we chose three particular messages. One, we focused on security of tenure. We wanted the no-fault ground to be removed from private rented tenancies. The no-fault ground has been removed from private tenancies, so that's a win. We wanted flexible tenancies, recognising that renters, unfortunately, because of the way that the labour market is, renters have to move quite a lot, and we don't want to be tied into long-term contracts because that doesn't reflect the way that people's lives are. And the third thing that we campaigned on was rent controls, because we recognise that renting is the most expensive and least high quality form of housing, and rent control was an easy sell. Most people who rent don't want to pay high rents, and actually it was campaigning on that particular issue worked very well, because what it did was it diverted the landlord lobby away from this issue of security of tenure. Landlords did not want to lose the no-fault ground of eviction. Landlords are still sad that they've lost the no-fault ground for eviction. However, during the process of our campaign, the focus was so heavily on rent controls that we managed to shift the discussion to be about rents, which meant that the security of tenure passed through fairly easily. So that was just a bit about the campaign. What we actually did, we had around 10,000 consultation responses go into the Scottish Government. We had stalls and did all sorts of different campaigning around that particular bill, and motivated and energised a lot of people around it. And I guess I would say, in terms of making that connection to land reform, I find personally that land reform can be a bit of a difficult and a complex topic that I sometimes find difficult to understand, in a similar way that campaigning around security of tenure can be complex and difficult to understand. But I think that if it's presented in such a way that people can mobilise behind through sort of simple, easy to understand messaging, then I think that would be a really good step forward, and it'd be certainly useful for my own understanding too. So that was really all I wanted to say. Sort of those two things about the fact that I think renters shouldn't be forgotten when it comes to land reform, and that we're often, not necessarily a group with a lot of power individually, but collectively, if we build organisations where we can come together, then that will hopefully change in the future.
Thank you for that, Liz. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes for discussion because we are running behind. A bit of housekeeping, just to ask you at the end of the session to stay in your seats. We're going to take all these down from around you so we can just get through the end of it, because we need to be out of here by 4 o'clock. Does anyone have any questions or points of discussion for anyone on the panel or the panel collectively?
How did the Duke of Buccleuch end up with so much land in the first place?
What a great question. Well, if you look at the history of it, 700 years is how long they've been really in their powerful position. They were essentially cattle rustlers, mafia, pretty powerful, aggressive people who set out to provide protection by extending their lands, because they're the newcomers. The majority of these big landowners go back to 1066, and this is why this is a revolution, because we're really tackling this. And if you look at the Highlands and Islands, when you get to Lewis and Harris, 75% of the population live on community-owned land, and that is a revolution.
So, I own 10 acres of Scotland. My croft is 10 acres, which is roughly twice my share. But when God made Scotland, he didn't hand down title deeds on tablets of stone. Montague Douglas Scott's faraway ancestor who first settled in Thornhill. The land of Scotland has been stolen. Virtually all of it has been stolen. Why are we content to allow this to be? And why are we content to believe that somebody can somehow come to own land?
Malcolm or Jen, do you want to come in on that?
Come in. Unless someone else wants to come in first.
Sure.
Because we can't imagine that it could be any different because it's been so long, and also because any of the proposals to, the more extreme proposals of like land grabs and stuff just sound like they wouldn't work, and I don't think they would. And because we haven't changed our taxation system, which is the thing that would actually work to break up these kind of things and bring down the price of land, because we seem somehow, through, I think, the sort of right-wing common sense that was referred to in the beginning plenary in this day, we don't believe that it's possible to change our taxation systems radically anymore, which is a failure of the left and a success of the right, I suppose, briefly. And that would be a total nightmare. It would be an absolute nightmare, and it would...
I mean, to jump in and be a lawyer for a moment, in any society that respects the rule of law, you've got to go through proper processes to and not unpick settled bargains completely, sort of thing. And even in jurisdictions like South Africa, where they've got a much more recent and raw wrong historically that they can look to, and they've actually got sort of racist acts from 1911, the sort of Native Title Act there that they can point at. They are still going down a system whereby they're not completely upsetting the apple cart. They are paying compensation, and yes, sure, there may have been historical incidents, there may have been strategic marriages that have allowed these people to come into massive land holdings, but where we are now, if we just sort of did away with the existing situations and property rights became fickle or fragile, there would be issues, and there is a human rights point as well, and I know that's a tricky one to mention, and I can see shaking of heads, and that's fine. There are human rights from both angles. There's human rights in terms of the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, in terms of rights for housing, sanitation, food, and using human rights as a driver for land reform as well, absolutely. But there is Article 1, Protocol 1 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which says that people are entitled to peaceful enjoyment of their possessions, unless you can demonstrate it's in the public interest and non-arbitrary to unpick that arrangement. And there have been cases where things have been looked at, and there was an important case, James against UK, where the Duke of Westminster was forced to sell his land to a private citizen, and the European Court of Human Rights said, yeah, that's absolutely fine, this is a policy that's in the social interest, but you've got to develop such measures properly in an open forum, and it's not just about sort of going, right, let's just start again and rip everything up and rip up the title deeds, because we are where we are. It's a but we are where we are.
We'll go here, and then there, and then here.
Hello, it's a kind of semi-legal question, and it's an urban environment one. I'm from Dumfries, and there's several very empty shops, been empty for years, right in the town centre. They happen to be built over a very historic spot, which is Greyfriars Kirk, where Robert the Bruce killed John Comyn. And we tried to acquire the shop to turn it into a visitor centre and museum and so on. But it's held by a trust, which is in England. Absolutely no intention of selling ever. Can't rent it, nobody wants it, so it just sits there and rots. And it's quite a high hurdle to get the community behind something like that, especially with an antagonistic press and an antagonistic council. Is there any future in that actually being lowered a bit, that kind of problem?
Is that something maybe you can come in compulsory sale orders?
There's actually, I mean, even before compulsory sale orders, there's a couple of things to mention very quickly. The way the land reform legislation is set up at the moment, you can, certainly in non-Highland Scotland and non-crofting areas, you can't force a sale as things stand, and the only trigger to allow for a community to get its right of first refusal is a transfer of the land itself, not any transfers of the trust or the shares in a company or anything like that. So if this, you've said they've got no plans to sort of transfer that, at the moment they can kind of just sit there, and you can't bring anything forward. Be that as it may, you've now got the Community Empowerment Scotland Act 2015, which is scheduled to come fully into force in early next year. Who knows when that will actually happen? The regulations have not been put forward, but that will give communities a right to force a sale of, as I say, abandoned, neglected, or it's sort of environmentally detrimental land is the phrase that's used in the legislation. Now, that in Parliament, at the time the legislation was going through, Aileen MacLeod, the then Minister, was asked, what does this mean? And she gave various examples of what would be environmentally mismanaged, and she included within that things like algae-filled ponds, abandoned and boarded up buildings, as things that might be sort of harmful to the environmental well-being of a community. So when that legislation is fully operative, as I say, it's on the statute book, it's just not been implemented yet. When that kicks in, a community forming up into a proper association, getting local support of 10% of the population, can then say, right, I think that asset has been environmentally mismanaged, or it's been abandoned, or it's been neglected, or whatever. And there could be a case. Maybe there could be a test case down there. There's no particular cultural heritage angle at the moment, so you might be able to wrap that up into some kind of community well-being angle, but I think you'd be reaching at the moment for that.
Thank you. We have one here, and I'll go with this gentleman here, and then this one down here.
Good afternoon. My name is Jim Orr. I'm a councillor from Edinburgh. I wasn't planning on asking a question, so it might not come out very easily. I'll just try and explain what I'd like to ask. I'm very interested in how to return Scotland to its natural habitat. And every time, even when I came through on the train from Edinburgh today, I can't help imagining how Scotland used to use before all the trees were cut down, and how wonderful that would have been for the natural, the world and raptors, etc. And I once heard a comment, I think, from Andy Whiteman, that it's not so much important who owns land as how the land is used. How it's used is critical to everything, and who owns it in some respects can be just by the by. And I was wondering if, I'd like to ask a question about how, perhaps the gentleman from One Lochhead would like to answer. Are there any good examples of how community land ownership has really improved biodiversity? I know the Scottish Government's got a reforestation strategy, and for my sins I've not got around to reading it yet, but I'd like to. But has that been tied into the land reform developments? And are there any good examples, perhaps yours from One Lochhead, where reforesting Scotland is a key part of these proposals, and it's really all about the natural world, which in some respects is almost as important as the human world?
Lincoln or anyone wants to come in there? Yeah.
It's very relevant in One Lochhead, suspended at the moment because the Duke has got plans for a wind farm. But so we have a monoculture, and since he got rid of 14 gamekeepers, we're now starting to see raptors, a huge variety of animals and birds. In the last 2 or 3 years, and it happened overnight. As soon as they stopped killing them, they were back. And one of our 93 ideas is reforestation, not of the entire area, but of a big part of it, because we have contamination in the village. We have lead contamination, and one of the things you can do to get rid of that is plant willow trees. And of course it's so big that governments exclude landowners from having to do anything about it, because they all accept it's too big a problem. So again, the community is interested in its environment. The Duke, for him, in his 240,000 acres, the few thousand acres around One Lochhead is not a priority.
Yeah.
Just a quick one. The current sort of land reform triggers that we have in Scotland are very much linked to whether or not there is a community there or is a tenant there, in terms of whether or not you can sort of change the ownership position. So for these areas that you might have been passing through that there's not a community there, they're not necessarily going to be able to use the existing land reform triggers that So there is a bigger policy question about whether you should be looking at different levers than just community ownership and or tenants being able to exercise a right to buy in some areas. The other thing I'd very quickly mention is there's been an impact study into the existing community rights to buy by people like Rob McMurrin and Sarah Skerritt from Scotland's Rural College. That came out in 2013, was commissioned by the Scottish Government, so they've looked at some of the environmental benefits and community benefits that these sort of 20 or so buyouts where they've happened, and it's quite tricky at this stage, it's still early doors, but you can look that up and just look for impact study of evaluation of the community right to buy, and there is some stuff out there in terms of trying to justify it.
Thank you. We've got a question here and a question here, and I'll see how we're doing for time.
My name's Rod, I'm from Angus, and the Angus Glens figure very highly in raptor persecution, as you probably know. Now, the Angus Glens have been bought by like fund hedge managers and people like that. So their interest has immediately been to evict all tenants. And only tenants who've managed to stay have perhaps been one farmer up Glenesk who, on the sale, it was said that he couldn't be put out, or his family. So what you have, and then all the houses are all done up. But there's nobody left there, there's no artisans left there. Everybody who lives in the Glens works for the owner of the Glens in a tied house. So I'm wondering if it was possible, would it be possible in future legislation within the sale of these estates, I wish there were God they couldn't be sold, and I wish God they couldn't be sold to foreign people as well, that there was an inbuilt thing that you couldn't put, like tenants who were there had to be able to stay, because they effectively, the Angus Glens were cleared very, very recently. There was an Angus clearance equivalent to Highland clearance. And all these houses up there, which have been done up at enormous expense, are not lived in, never a chimney smokes, and never a light burns in them. They're there as an asset. And it's horrendous, you know, it really is horrendous. The community's gone. Of course the people that live there support the landowner, because they don't have a house that they don't. You know?
There's so much shit going on like this. It is. Do you know what I mean? Though? It's like so in the sessions earlier today, people were talking about the kind of police brutality and racism that is commonplace in Scotland. I think it's very important that this whole conference has not just the idea of, you know, why we want independence and what we need to do to get towards that. I'm increasingly, you know, that doesn't excite me very much anymore, because I'm not quite sure what kind of independence it would. I mean, I still want it, but it was always, for me, a means to an end. And at the moment, there's so much going on in Scotland that we're just not aware of enough. Like when Andrew Stoddart was evicted from his... That was a 19,000 person petition, protests outside Parliament, and still the Scottish Government really, they didn't intervene in the way they could have. They let that eviction happen. These people still hold such huge power. There's more tenant farmers going to be evicted soon, in a matter of months, and even more next year. This is happening all the time. And I suppose... yeah, I would. You know, there are campaigns like the Our Land campaign highlights these things, and then there's petitions, and just always try and jump on them and get as much energy around these as possible. Partly to make these people feel less isolated and alone when they're up against such a massive amount of power, and partly to build this political movement around practical solidarity and winning things. You know.
Yeah. Just. Sort of the lawyer in me wants to say that since 1449 there has been legislation from the old Scottish Parliament that says when a landowner acquires land and there's a tenant there that's properly there, that lease continues. But what happens is, unless you've got a certain specialist type of lease that gives you security of tenure, as soon as there's a chance to get vacant possession, what landowners do at the moment will, both because of the prevailing climate, because they're worried about land reform and they're worried about tenants getting stronger rights, and also for things like reasons linked to subsidies as well, they'll just very quickly try and get the land back in hand. And that's contributing to what you're referring to as almost sort of later stage clearance. And you mentioned Andrew Stoddart. actually he wasn't, strictly speaking, in law himself the tenant. It was a limited partnership that had been set up so that as a legal device. It's a tricky thing. I could speak about that for about a day. I wrote a blog post about it. If I can refer you to try and explain how it works. But yeah, so there are questions about the actual question about what you can do now is about, can you make these leases assignable or available on inheritance to other people in a way that doesn't break the chain of security of tenure? There are things about that in Part 10 of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016, so the position is changing. Whether or not it's too little, too late, because there are places around, like I went to Glengay about a year and a half ago, and this was an area that did not get the protection of the crofting sort of controls that came in the Highland counties. And you've got so many clachans that just aren't there anymore, sort of signs of life, but they're not there, and their protections came too late. So, yeah, it's maybe too little, too late, but there are things coming.
You had a question here?
I'd like to mention land revenue tax, which is also known as land value tax or annual ground rent. Can I suggest, before I ask the panel about that, if everybody could write down, if you haven't already heard of the name Henry George, if you would please write down that name and Google it when you get home, and you will find that lots and lots of answers to all these questions have been there since the mid-19th century. In fact, Henry George's plans were almost adopted by Glasgow City Council, but the First World War came in and intervened and prevented it from happening. So I just wondered if anybody would like to just make a comment about the land revenue tax.
It's certainly something that has been mooted on and off, and taxation of land in Scotland tends to be done on a transactional basis as opposed to when the land is sitting there. You've got, again, an element of revenue reform that's coming in the most recent legislation where they're reintroducing rates to sporting estates. But the wider question about should you have that extra fiscal step towards land reform, it would undoubtedly be a driver in the same way as sort of changing the way council tax banding for second homes works or something like that. So there is an argument to be made. It's one for fiscal policy rather than for me as a land lawyer to make, though. Anyone else?
Can I add? Yes. Simon? That was one of the many very, very, very good proposals in the original document. How was it, like 52 proposals in that original land reform? 62. And most of them were completely within the competence of the Scottish Parliament, most of them, and like many of the really good ones, land value tax was dropped, despite huge amount of pressure and public support for these kind of radical steps. So I think anyone who's a member of the SNP needs to ask why they keep dropping these radical proposals whilst using the language of radical land reform at the same time, which I personally find quite annoying.
Hi, I wouldn't normally presume to disagree with Andy Whiteman, who knows a very great deal about land reform, but he believes that land value tax would be an important engine in moving towards land reform. I strongly believe he's wrong. Land value tax is in itself a good thing, and I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have land value tax, but the fact is that there are economics of scale in land holding, and if you tax land on the basis of the value of the hectare, then the landowner who owns more still benefits under that. And therefore we also need a land taxation system which, like income tax, is progressive. The more land you own, the more you should pay per hectare.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes left. Does anyone else have any? I saw your hand go up earlier.
What about the foreshore? The foreshore. Will it be possible for the community to do that? The reason I'm asking that is Saltcoats States are addressing the shellfish. There's tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, and at this moment in time private companies and individuals come in and take it, and the community don't get any benefit. I think there's half a job now. So what about the foreshore?
The tradition at Scots common law is that the foreshore, that is to say, the bit between low tide and high tide, is the Crown's. And that's managed by the Crown Estate. Now, that's been tweaked a little bit by the Scotland Act 2016 in terms of devolution. I'm not quite sure what competences have come the way of the Parliament in terms of what they could do to reform it. But unless there has been some kind of grant by the Crown to the community in relation to that land, the community will not necessarily have an automatic right to develop on the foreshore. So there are certain rights that people have to go for a wander on the foreshore, go white fishing and so on, but actually building a marina or something like that, you'd need to sort of talk to the Crown Estate and or get a grant from them as things stand. The way the land reform set up is at the moment, there's nothing really you can do to force anything. Pass. Sorry.
Malcolm, what about Port Patrick? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay, fair enough.
Do you know anything?
Well, only that they seem to have bought part of the shore to make a proper marina and so on.
Yeah. I mean, there are examples of sort of schemes that have taken up at Rue towards Helensburgh, and I think the South Uist Estates have entered into some. They've got a new marina, and actually didn't the Calmac ferry just crash into it or something like that pretty recently? So there's a topical reference for you. But as I say, the actual sort of the foreshore itself, by Crown prerogative, is managed by the Crown. And if you want to know more about that, you can send an email to my colleague Professor Roddy Paisley, who did his PhD on it.
One more question. I'm aware you've asked a few. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. If not, we'll just go. We'll get the two of you together to finish off. Or are we told to, is that us? No, let's just keep going.
Can you hold it, please? Sure. It's not really a question. I just wanted to read out like a quote, which I think illustrates a couple of problems that we have. This is in Angus. This is from Arbroath, and recently, 4 small blocks of flats near the centre of town have been demolished. And this is a councillor whose title was the Communities Convener of the council. The floor blocks of flats have been unpopular as council housing accommodation for many years and became increasingly difficult to let. It's also considered that their close proximity to the Abbey and High Street has had a negative effect on business, retail and tourism. Our housing vision is to create places that people are proud to call home. We plan to replace these flats with energy-efficient, low-rise accommodation designed to complement the Abbey and where people can enjoy living. The Abbey is a landmark of international significance, so it's right that we do our best to enhance its surroundings and create an experience for residents and visitors that we can be proud of. So obviously the tenants that previously lived in these blocks were people that had problems, possibly drugs or unemployment or other things like that. So, and what he doesn't say is that they're going to have 42 houses, whereas previously this flatted accommodation was maybe 60, 70 houses. But I think this maybe talks to what Jen was kind of saying. Independence isn't enough. The people that are in charge, that are making these decisions, these are Scottish people in Scotland, and this is the council, and this is council-owned land. So they're doing this on our behalf. And it's an SNP council, by the way. That was all. Thank you.
I think this kind of thing highlights why community ownership is a good thing, because it gives the power to the community to make these decisions. And I'd like to just read something that's from the blurb from Drumlanrig Castle, which of course is the Duke of Buccleuch's castle in the Queensberry estate, which is about 15 miles from us in One Lock Head. And it says, think of the 90,000 acres of the magnificent countryside that make up the Queensberry estate as your very own natural adventure playground. Whether your idea of excitement is fishing, walking, or wildlife appreciation, you'll find unspoiled countryside. Yes, we will. And we like his suggestion that we should think of it as our own.
Well, I think we will pause there. Thank you very much to all of our lovely speakers and to all of you for coming along. As I said, we're just going to have a short wrapping up, so if you all could stay in your seats, they'll take all these walls away again. Oh, just like that. And thank you all for coming today.
I wasn't expecting that. Yeah, got the other.
So there, viewers, I hope you can hear me there. That's the end of this stream. Sorry, we had a bit of an issue on stream 3, catching the beginning of them, some glitches setting up YouTube events. However, most of the events were there. So that wraps up the coverage of this particular room for today. So from Independence Live, cheers for now. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.